Hey, everybody. Just a quick show of hands before we get started. How many people in the room are students? Okay, faculty? Practitioner in Los Angeles, game designer, game developer type person? Okay. Writer, sound person, other? Ooh, a lot of other. Working person? Okay, so we're gonna be a little bit more freeform than the last panel, and I'm just gonna do some opening remarks about mobility and gaming. Unfortunately, Ben Severny, one of our beloved friends, was supposed to join us for the panel and couldn't, but Kevin has graciously agreed to fill in, so we're very excited. I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas that Ben and I were discussing briefly before he had to leave the city to go back to Amsterdam about mobility and gaming, and then Ian's going to give a presentation sort of taking those a little bit further and doing a little bit of deconstruction on a project that he worked on, and then we're also going to get introduced to some new ideas that Neville is working on for an iPhone application. Then we're going to open it up and have a conversation about game design and kind of do some on-site brainstorming and hopefully get you guys involved as well. So with that, one of the things that's interesting about mobility and gaming, and that's just so that you know, I'm a game producer. I work at that game company here in Santa Monica. We make games for the PlayStation 3 for download for PSN. We have a very sort of narrow view of mobility with respect to gaming right now in our industry. And so when we were listening to Ben talk a little bit earlier, you know, there's some stuff about the difference between portability and mobility and the difference between being somewhere and doing something in that place and then those things being connected. Right now, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about where you are when you're gaming. If you have an iPhone and you're playing a game on it, it's not often the case that commercial games or even independent games, small games that are made for those applications, really consider your location. And as you all know, that's sort of problematic. But what I wanted to do when I was getting ready for this presentation was just think a little bit about where people were. So I started just kind of going into Flickr and up on Google and looking at places where people might be. So here's one place that we spend a lot of time, especially in Los Angeles. Here's another one that might be sort of familiar to you. When I was looking for these photos, I deliberately picked stuff that wasn't very pretty and wasn't very artistically staged, that made me have feelings about those locations themselves. When we talk about mobility and gaming and mobility, this is what we have to consider. The sort of actual activity that people are doing or have just done before they open up the phone or turn on their DS. And so when you've been doing this, and then you're in a crowded train cabinet surrounded by Starbucks and people with cameras and tourists and stuff, you have a very different expression of self than you would, say, if you're sitting on your couch at home with a controller in your jammies. And this is a really critical thing for designers to consider for gaming applications because we have to be readable and present instantly in the mind of a player. We can't afford for there to be a lack of clear boundary or a lack of instruction or a lack of clarity because they have to get into it and have fun quickly, especially in this context, because maybe they only have 15, 20 minutes. This is another context that I think people are in a lot lately, which is some sort of co-located environment, right, where you're using your computer. It's very common with students. I just actually found this by Googling people in a coffee shop. Sometimes it's more solitary, and I always get a lot of great work done when I'm in a coffee shop because I feel like the pressure of having people around me makes me feel like I should be doing something, which of course then immediately makes me feel guilty for gaming, which is another thing that games in this space have to consider. Not only do we have to consider the actual emotional and physical context of that person and how that's impacting their ability to get into a play space in their mind, but should they be working? Will they feel industrious? Will they feel like they're slacking off? And so forth. Here's another context, one that we all go through. I actually found this photo interesting because I wasn't sure if she was looking at a piece of food or her phone. Maybe she's carefully reading the back of this cheese, trying to decide if it has some toxic retin in it or something. Maybe she's vegan. even now, going to the grocery store, you constantly have that context with you, that phone, you're aware of it all the time, but you're engaged in a sort of intimate activity when you're there. Can I put this in my body? That's kind of what this picture made me think of. Or this one. I need it, I want it. Can I have it now? Oh my gosh, look, it's got stars or elephants on the package or whatever. This is another context that's really common, and it's not just common in the grocery store, but it's common on the train and maybe even in the car. And one of the things that traditional gaming has done for mobility has given people a context through like a portable handheld device, like a PSP Go or a DS, to just shut up, like just not be doing stuff right now, so that mom can concentrate or so that dad can figure out how to get through this horrible traffic to the event that you're getting to, right? And so these are the sorts of things that when you think about mobility in gaming, for us, that's kind of the boundary that we get to. It's a handheld portable game, so I have to make sure that people will be able to get into it, figure out where they were, start doing their campaign, execute some stuff, and feel good. And, it has to have big buttons so that you can use it if you're small, and things like that. Very, very much about designing for the constraint of the situation, which is a response to the fact that gaming for mobility, for us, is very difficult, since for many, many years we were gaming for you sitting alone at your PC or you sitting alone in front of your television, or possibly being virtually co-located with a few people over an internet. Even that's new for us. So we tend to see mobility as a very, very hard set of constraints for the very necessary clarity that comes from having to deliver a commercial product, something like a Pokemon, for example. But depending on where you live in the world and how you structure your day, the mobile device that you have with you, like an iPhone or a smartphone, suddenly starts to seep into contexts that are much less known to Western game developers. And there's a lot of opportunities there, and I don't really feel like we're taking advantage of them, and yet I think that we're accelerating very rapidly to a point where it will just happen that someone who lives in this context will come up with a great gaming type application that's appropriate in this context. And it probably won't be someone from a Los Angeles-based development company. One of the other things I found interesting about sort of sorting these photos was just thinking about who's in the photos and what's appropriate. If I'm in a gaming context and I'm at the grocery store, am I just playing the game? Is my spouse playing it? Is my baby playing it? To what extent could I be leveling up in points for having found the best, juiciest orange in the city, and at the same time constantly be dealing with baby dribble or something? And then this is the other context. I think this is where we've spent more of our time in developing gaming applications lately, has been in the social space. Love these photos. These people are having a really good time. What's interesting to me about the context of gaming in, say, a social club or youth setting is that I recently went out to a club in Venice, an old club out on the beach. It's been there for many, many years. It used to be a speakeasy. And I just happened to be out on a Friday night in Venice. It's not common for me. I'm sort of mostly usually at home in front of my computer or my television playing old games. But I wanted to go out and see. It was a nice night. I just wanted to walk down to the beach, go to a club, and see what people were doing. What do you think people were doing? They were looking at their iPhones. Like every single woman in this club was dressed to the nines, and there was this very familiar pattern of behavior. They would engage in a sort of overtly sexual dance act with another hot girl, and then step away from each other, and then nervously Twitter, or look at their phones, and oh my God, take pictures, and then talk about it and stuff. And it was this completely performative act mitigated by the surface of their phone. And everywhere you looked in the club, you could see all the lights, the uplight of the phone against their face, right? It's this social lubricant in a totally different way from the drink, but then it's competing for the drink for real estate, and if you're playing Foursquare or some sort of game where you're trying to communicate with other hot, young, available, dressed to the nine Venice ladies and men, like, you're just doing a lot of stuff. It's really actually quite complex set of actions. And as a game designer, I find that kind of totally freaky. Like, how am I going to get into that space? Like, it's enough that the photo app gets turned on, or Twitter gets turned on, or I get to like check and see if someone's coming up to the club. That's about all I can get on that person's screen, their mental screen right now. So I'm not going to talk a lot more about game design specifically right now, but I wanted to make a few points based on my own perceptions of what's sort of transpired in the conversation already. We were hearing a little bit before about the messy relationships between sort of digital media and real life. And as I was explaining, game behavior needs believability or readability at a very core level a lot of the time. When you're designing a gameplay activity that's supposed to be structured and to last for more than a moment, it's not a conversation, it's a dialogue between you and this other world or this other creature or this other activity. It's really critical, especially given the pressure of mobile context, that you have an instant read and transparency. And what I love about the space that people that are not in gaming, but that space that they can explore, what I love about that space is that it doesn't have to have this constraint. And I wanted to just like give a little shout out to all of the people that are sort of existing in that research layer, especially related to sort of, you know, the Nokia work and some of the Open City work that's happening, because there's an opportunity there to play with messy boundaries that we don't get to play with in gaming spaces as often, especially not in commercial gaming. And I really think there's a lot of interesting stuff there, but I wanted to call out specifically that for this panel, that's not something that we can usually do in a commercial product that's successful. It's just people won't sit with it for very long. They'll just say, this is not, it's too arty. The other problem that we often see in the mobile space with respect to gaming is oversimplification, and I think Ian is going to speak at length about this. But the idea that in order to sort of understand the activity that you're engaging in the game space versus the sort of noise, the and the drinks and all that stuff that I was talking about before, we end up with a really simplified strata of game over a very simplified reward strategy, and it ends up being sort of meaningless. And that's another real problem that we have to struggle with in gaming. How do I make a game that doesn't exploit the sort of messy relationship to the point that it's not transparent to a player, but is also really actually meaningful, that they want to come back to? It doesn't just feel like a candy that they pop in their mouth and then they're done with it. And finally, I think this is a complaint that I heard just sort of in some of the dialogue this morning, this heavy reliance on sort of a convenient metaphor, maps, graphs, networks, and things like that, the data metaphors that nerds like us are used to manipulating. I mean, I'm sure it's no surprise that game designers love flowcharts and graphs and data points and stuff. And actually, I think it's often very difficult for game designers to be present in space and in their lives and their daily activities in the way that a normal person is, because they're constantly analyzing it on that level of statistics. It's one of the things that makes a great game designer, but it also separates you from everyday living sometimes. And we need to start looking beyond those if we're going to come up with innovative applications. But we still need to find the magic. And I really think it's important for us to continue this dialogue as we move into the panel. How do we get past the context of those photos that I grabbed off the internet, which is very real and very, very much not about any designer in this room, to a feeling of magic, to a place of transport, to an experience that takes people beyond a crowded train car? My personal bias is that you get there by starting with mechanics that people understand, and if you get on Virgin Airlines today and take a flight up to San Francisco and play any of the games on the back of the seat in front of you, which technically is a mobile game, you will find that the games are all about the same stuff that they were on the Atari 2600. Accomplish something, find something, get it, and save it, or hoard it, or spend it. Create order out of chaos. Destroy lots of stuff. or escape from things that are chasing you. These are like very, very common things that we rely on in terms of basic game mechanics. And if you look at a very popular game like Left 4 Dead, it's pretty much all about escaping stuff and destroying stuff. And there's a little bit of finding and accomplishing in there. I mean, you can really see a lot of games and these sorts of verbs. And I would argue that you can actually start to create a sentence about your application, your mobile application, your fun that you're trying to give players by simply doing something like this. Accomplish by learning, find food in this environment, get some sex, get some order in the workspace that you need to do, destroy the problems that you're experiencing, escape the anxiety that you feel. This could actually be a person's schedule for the day. One might argue that it is a proto-schedule for all days. Depending on the kind of urban environment you live in or the kind of rural environment you live in, it might have different constraints. But these are things that we've been doing forever. And Maslow was the first to suggest it, but I think we've all seen it in many, many games, most notably The Sims. So how do we do that and maintain a present idea of localness, of locality, of co-location, of you, me, and that guy are standing next to each other at the bar, suddenly, we're hacked, and there's a conversation happening there. Where are those boundaries? And I think those are the things that designers are thinking about now in the commercial space that have clearly been thought about in the academic space for much longer. So if anything, I'm here to listen. But just in case you didn't know, these are the sort of things we've been doing. We've been building games where you simulate a rock band and then you play together as a group in your living room, and then you can transmit the results of your gameplay online and you can compete with other living rooms all around the world. Or we have been creating real-time data analysis based on staged events and then using them to illustrate the results of those events or to indicate layers of gameplay and strategy above those events. I think if you look at this is, I think, what people think of as being gaming. That's what I think of as being mobile gaming. I think mobile gaming is going to be a lot more like what you see during a Monday Night Football game on the television. It's going to be much more about conversations about action happening in front of you right now that's relevant to you because it's visceral, it's sexy, it's juicy, it has a competitive nature, it has an element of spectatorship. I think these are the places where really interesting mobile games that take advantage of locality and mobility will be looking. They will not be looking here. It's a pretty boring picture. And I think that comes from focusing on the right things. And so with that, I will let Ian come up here and talk to you about focusing his efforts on a game itself.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Robin. So if you use the DVD rental service Netflix, or even if you don't use it, you may have heard of the Netflix Prize. This is this system whereby the company awarded $1 million to the group or individual that improved their recommendation algorithm, which is called Cinematch, by a factor of 10%. And this actually just happened within the last month. It had been going on for some time. About a year ago, in the New York Times Magazine, Clive Thompson wrote a piece about this process as it was going on. And it turned out that a 10% improvement was actually way harder than it seemed. And one of the reasons was what Clive called the Napoleon Dynamite problem. And it goes like this. Here's Clive from the magazine. It's maddeningly hard to determine how much people will like Napoleon Dynamite. When Bertoni, this is one of the guys who we interviewed, who was working on the algorithm, runs his runs his algorithms on regular hits like Lethal Weapon or Miscongeniality and tries to predict how any given Netflix user will rate them, he's usually within 8/10 of a star. But with films like Napoleon Dynamite, he's off by an average of 1.2 stars. This was a year ago. Recently, just a month or two ago, Netflix awarded the prize, and here the guy's enjoying their checks. Kind of a lot of them. It makes the $1 million not go quite as far, but collaboration is good, except if there's a $1 million prize. Anyway, there's a guy named Tom Slee who's an author, a Canadian author, and he did an analysis of the algorithm that the winners came up with. It was different from the Len Bertoni algorithm. And what he found was that Napoleon Dynamite still has a way higher error rate than any of the other movies that have been rated this many times, more than 50,000 times. And in fact, it's just as bad as it was a year ago when Thompson did this piece on Bertoni. Now, when you ask people about this, when they talk about the article, many folks conclude that, well, Napoleon Dynamite, it's hard to rate because it's just really quirky. And this is a totally unsatisfying explanation because it's tautological. It's like saying Napoleon Dynamite is hard to predict because it's a hard-to-predict movie. But why is it hard to predict? And I think the reason that people have trouble with the film is that it speaks only kind of partly through its narrative, and a large part of the meaning is somehow embedded in other things that we're not used to finding legible, like costume design and production design. And there's all this kind of incoherent stuff. Like they're temporal anomalies, the side ponytail and the moon boots and the trapper keeper in the same context as the internet and the sort of contemporary slang. And in fact, the film gives us a very specific temporal location, and it's just very confusing. And when the filmmakers were asked, sort of, hey, when did this movie take place? I can't quite place it. Reportedly, the response was Idaho. And this is an amazing clue about both the meaning of the film and also why it's maybe so hard to pin down. It's kind of a mise en abîme of nested statements about a really weird kind of alienation, a sort of blithe, earnest alienation. And it sits on multiple scales at the level of this small town in Idaho in which those things kind of take place at different scales on the level of the family or of the individual. And it kind of is setting these themes in relief against its production design. And so, in some ways the film feels like hipster irony, and I think people either like it or hate it because it feels like hipster irony. But then at the same time, it's really a kind of earnest portrait of this kind of strangely weird alienation of living so far off the grid, but still within civilization. And people don't know what to make of it because it's performing these things simultaneously. So there's a concept in art and optics called anamorphosis, and it's usually described like this. An anamorphic image is one that appears distorted unless it's viewed at a special angle or with a special instrument. And there are lots of examples of this. In fact, speaking of cinema, because this is a mobile games panel, cinematic projection often uses this thing called anamorphic widescreen, and there's an optical distortion on the camera lens that allows it to squash that wide image onto the narrow 35 millimeter film, and then the projector corrects the distortion so that it becomes wide again. But in art, there are usually two kinds of anamorphosis: catoptric anamorphosis, which uses these like cylindrical or conical mirrors to transform a distorted image into a legible one, and there's all sorts of histories of coding and things that use these, and oblique anamorphosis, in which the image has to be viewed from a position different from the usual straight-ahead view. This is a very famous example of oblique anamorphosis. It's a painting by Hans Holbein from 1533 called The Ambassadors, and it depicts two wealthy, educated, and powerful young men, and it follows in this long tradition of paintings that show learned men with books and instruments of the elite. But it also functions as a disruption of that idea, a memento mori, in which there's this kind of stain across the image, which you see at the bottom. And if this painting is viewed from the correct angle, then it becomes visible as a skull. You sort of see it here in the bottom. And oops, I'm not ready for Lacan yet. So here it is in its straight-on view, and you kind of see that there's something wrong with the painting, but you're not quite sure what it is. And then upon moving beyond the painting and glancing back at it, you would see this skull, which sort of disrupts the idea of what the painting is all about in its tradition. Now, everybody's favorite psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, would later use this example, Holbein's painting in particular, as an example of the gaze, which he was obsessed with. And he also adapted it into his famous restatement of Descartes' cogito, which goes like this: I think of what I am where I do not think to think. Or as Zizek restated it, kind of generalizing this idea, sometimes we have to look awry in order to see things in their clear and distinct form. We need to look at them differently and disturbed. Now, yesterday, Kevin Slavin talked about the way that games can introduce noise into situations and use this example of the absent noise, analog noise on the original Sprint digital phone lines. And there's a way in which anamorphosis is a kind of noise, but it's one that serves a more specific purpose. And this is what I want to relate to mobile game design. So, in my conception, games are models of systems, and those systems force players to reconcile ideas about the systems that the game represents. So, in a game, you approach it, and you're a player, and you've got some idea about how something operates, and that idea has certain kinds of properties. And then the game also has some model of the world that it constructs, and that model has its own properties. And when you play the game, those two models are put into relief. And you kind of see, gosh, well, I've got this conception of how something operates, and the game seems to have this other one. And they kind of converge and diverge in different ways. And when you play a game critically, then you sort of contend with the mismatches between your internal models and the ludic models in the game. And it may be as startling or distressing, or you disagree with it, or what have you. In the past, I've called this dynamic, this kind of mismatch of models, simulation fever. Now, if we kind of collapse the representation and the situation that it represents so that they're closer together, then the dissonances might become even more apparent. And thereby the deliberation could be amplified. And we could say that mobile devices in particular offer an opportunity to make this possible because they allow us to put ourselves in more specific situations, situations that may match those that the game's model is attempting to depict. So, for example, in this game called Cruel to Be Kind that Jane McGonigal and I designed, the game is essentially Assassin, but instead of killing people, you compliment them. And you play it on the street, and players don't know who is playing the game, so they end up, complimenting random strangers, and they realize in so doing that they ordinarily don't have any relationship whatsoever with these people. So there's this kind of coupling between the experience of the game and the rules of the game, and a sort of social experience that's disrupted. In fact, Jane has this idea about alternate reality games. I mean, we hear this word thrown around quite a lot now, but in her original conception of this idea, alternate reality games are not fantasy worlds that we kind of leave our real world in order to enter, but sort of this interchange of different worlds that we can move between to show us new choices. And we might conclude that the salient feature of mobile games is not really that they're mobile, but that they can be situated in an arbitrary way. And then we begin to kind of build these wormholes between two worlds in which one begins to bleed and seep into the other, making them kind of hum. So lately, we've been hearing a lot about this in terms of how games can add this kind of layer of fun or interest atop ordinary experiences to make them less afflictive, because our lives suck and we want them to be better. But the problem with this is that it doesn't really add any sort of critical perspective on the practice itself of what you're doing. It doesn't add any noise, if you want to use Slavin's word for it. So take, for example, this thing called Foursquare. This is a game that you can play on your mobile phone when you go out, like to the club that we saw the girls grinding at. And you can check in and find out who is nearby. It's kind of like dodgeball, if you remember that. But there's this layer of gaminess atop, and when you check in, you get points. And if you do certain tasks, then you can get these badges, like you see here, like little rewards. And if you check in enough at the same place, more than other people, then you become the mayor of the place, and it sends out notices to your Twitter stream and things like that. So if we kind of take this game and throw it on top of this model that I have, this simulation fever model, then it works something like this. So the player goes, oh, I'm going out. And then the game responds, wow, you are totally awesome. It's a totally smooth space. The game model and the world model are identical, and they're just reinforcing one another. It's like a kind of behaviorist partial reinforcement. Or maybe, it's like a participation trophy every single day. And, if you ask me, this is total bullshit. So I was thinking about this, and about a year ago at the studio, we decided we were trying to design kind of an anamorphic mobile game. And we did this thing called Jet Set, which we subtitled A Game for Airports. And this was a game that you were going to play in an airport. I travel a lot, so I'm obsessed with travel. And I wanted to explore that idea using some of these principles that I've been describing. So in the game part of the game, you wait in line. So while you're waiting in line at airport security, then you play this game where you wait in line at airport security. And you're trying to keep track of things, different banned items, and they're changing all the time, like they really do in the ordinary world. And all of the items were drawn from real TSA incidents from the past few years, yes, including pressurized cheese. And in addition, the game knows about 100 different airports worldwide, and if you play in those airports and you reach particular score thresholds, then you earn these souvenirs. And we designed specific souvenirs for every one of these 100 airports that have something to do with the location but are not super obvious. The cola bottle from Atlanta, where I'm from. And there are different levels of these awards which correspond with frequent flyer loyalty levels, silver, gold, and platinum. Here you see the platinum version of the cola bottle snow globe. And then you could download these things to Facebook, where they serve as the kind of social capital that many of us who are obsessed with frequent flyer miles and so forth already use in our daily lives. And it's like, look at me, I'm a world traveler, look at all the places I've been. Here's part of my page. And you can also give them to people. You were kind of commenting, too, on the whole gifting mechanism, the digital goods, virtual goods gifting mechanism. And I hope this would also draw attention to use versus exchange value in travel capital, that idea of what you're bringing home. When I go and I travel, and I realize that the most interesting things I bring home are the cookies from the airplane, which my kids like, and anything else is sort of meaningless. And you could also take those things when you receive them from someone and download them back down to your iPhone, and you have this virtual object that you could take along with you. Or if you feel like it, you can just hoard the souvenirs that you collect. And if you save them up from different airports, because you're so worldly that you've traveled to all these different airports, you can trade them in for tangible rewards. So here's some that we've done in the past. We tried to switch them out every now and then. But in order to do that, you would have to trade in the social capital you get for demonstrating all of the places that you've been. And this seemed like an interesting way of setting in relief the whole problem of desiring to travel, wanting to be out in the world and be worldly, and then the guilt and misery of the actual experience and how you kind of try to mediate between those. But we sort of failed utterly at doing this. And I think that the reason is actually the same as the Napoleon Dynamite problem. For one thing, we only explored one of the many anamorphic wormholes, if you will, that exist between my idea of why I travel and what it means to be a business traveler and the experience itself. And we translated this one queuing experience, but we really needed more hooks because this is one moment, and it had to be these mundane kind of experiences, because it's all mundane experiences at the airport. It's you're waiting in security, and then you're waiting in the lounge, and then you're waiting to get on the plane, and then you're waiting in your seat on the plane, and then you're just sitting there on the plane, and then you're waiting to get off, and then you're waiting for your baggage, and all of that sort of stuff, that sort of ordinary mundane meaninglessness of travel was what I wanted to get at, and we weren't able to reinforce it enough, so it kind of read as this satire of airport security, which is what it was, but it wasn't enough. There are reasons for that, but I'll skip them for now. And then, of course, and this is the thing that's so different from Foursquare, when you play Jet Set well, you completely break the experience, because you go to your home airport and you've earned the platinum medal or whatever, and you go there all the time because that's where you fly out of, and the game becomes completely valueless. You don't want to play it anymore because it's not rewarding you. It's not saying, oh, look how awesome you are, look where you're going. Which actually was a part of the experience I wanted it to create, but this didn't code well for the players who were wanting that reinforcement of a Foursquare-style experience. So, one answer, there's a lot we could say about this, but one answer may lie in Holbein's stain, that there needs to be some sort of signal that explicitly invites us to read the game model and the world model against one another. And we could imagine kind of inserting the mobile device as the anamorphic operator, the anamorphic tool. We could imagine ourselves doing this sort of anamorphic game design process in which we're trying to set up these mirrors to see the distorted world in new form, rather than to use the device as a kind of lens or window that just reveals the subterranean dimensions of the world we expect. So that's it. Thanks.
Neville's going to talk to us now, and then we'll do a group Q&A and some discussion and games and stuff.
Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Neville, and it's great to be here. And thanks, Robin, for inviting me to participate in this panel. So I'm the founder of a new technology startup called Hunicke Media, and we're based here in Los Angeles, and we just started at the beginning of this year, and we are making mobile games. So to start with, I wanted to share kind of my personal view of the phone. I really do think that the mobile phone is the magic wand of the 21st century. I think that there's a tremendous power and capability inherent in a device that people all around the world carry with them wherever they go, and as we progress, there's more and more capabilities that are being deployed on these devices, and so in a sense we become sorcerers, and with great power comes great responsibility. So I also, still remember the first time that I picked up a phone and decided to use it for work, and was very much all of a sudden caught up in emails, and soon enough I'm having arguments with my girlfriend because I'm playing a video game because she just momentarily stepped out of the room, and it's causing all of this disharmony in terms of kind of the real world. But so with all that aside, there's definitely kind of looking at what are the benefits inherent in using the mobile phone. So there's a ton of games out there on cell devices out there, whether it's an iPhone, what have you, and for the most part, a lot of the games are essentially ports or adaptations of games that people are already familiar with. So a classic game is, Scrabble, which a lot of us, love, and it's kind of cool that you can now play Scrabble on your cell phone, and perhaps even share your score with your friends because your phone is connected to your friend's phone. But there's a fundamental difference, I think, between game experiences which are effectively ports of a game experience that people are already familiar with in another context, versus game experiences which are really designed with the mobile device at the core and at the center. So, what is the magic of the mobile device? And I kind of, at the end of the day, I distill it into two things which have been, touched on in great detail with, fellow speakers today. One is fundamentally, location, location, location. Where you are literally located relative to the coordinate system of the planet is a very useful piece of information that you can derive a lot of value and meaning from, and apply it to a number of different contexts and game experiences. And the other, of course, is that, the phone's a phone. It's a communication device. It is inherently a networked tool, and with that is the ability to engage in activities and experiences that are inherently multidimensionally connected and interconnected. So to kind of set some context, as I was thinking about, okay, I wanted this to be largely a conversation and an opportunity for me to share some ideas, to think about sort of what are some of the things that you can do today on your cell phone that you couldn't do 3 years ago, right? So if you think about that for a moment, right, when's the last cell phone that you bought? Is it 2 years old? Is it 3 years ago? And then I'd also like to ask the question, and for you to think a little bit about what do you envision being able to do on your cell phone 3 years from today? So, I think that so here are some examples of activities which my friends and I use my phone for today. And sort of this repertoire of capabilities has been increasing fairly rapidly. Getting here today, I relied entirely on my iPhone in order to navigate to the parking lot number 3, which it turns out is not mapped on Google Maps, and it was a horrific experience actually trying to figure it out. That was because I didn't have a printout, and luckily, Casey came out to rescue me. But so, thinking 3 years from now, there's a lot of really interesting concepts and ideas which were discussed even in the course of today's symposium so far. And there's multiple directions this can go. One specific pattern which I'm starting to see, and obviously a lot of people are seeing, is this notion of sensing of location, sensing of where you are and where your phone is, which is usually in your pocket. Then there's this aspect of data sensing, where there's sort of the aspect of filtering data that is relevant to where you are. There's this notion of social sensing, where now the device also has some mapping into the social graph through other data sets that are available on your network device. And then perhaps extrapolating a little bit further, we can think about, is there an opportunity to move into emotion sensing, where you're starting to be perhaps in touch with, on an emotional level, with other cell phone carriers around you and around the world. So I quickly updated my slide after the talk earlier today from Sense, when we're looking at sort of the participatory sense being another dimension of this. So I've often thought about my phone effectively becoming my sixth sense. I'm by no means advocating that as humans we shouldn't continue to evolve our capability to develop our own psychic abilities and our own telepathic abilities, but it does seem to me that there's an increasing trend towards the device becoming this all-knowing tool that can provide you with all kinds of information that you wouldn't have otherwise. So what does all of this have to do with gaming? If you look at kind of the broadest definition of gaming and play, in essence, if there's an interaction that is remotely involving fun, then arguably you're talking about a game. And I'm not going to get into the semantics and definitions of what's a game and what isn't. Another axis of an axis of analysis for the different kinds of games which are available today is sort of the spectrum from the typical hardcore game, which is typically available on a high-end console, where the user is deeply engaged in one very singular experience that's very rich, all the way through to the other end of the spectrum, where you're talking about a more casual gaming experience. And again, I'm not going to get too caught up into the accuracy of these definitions or if they're useful, but you could argue that spending some time on Facebook and seeing what your friends are up to and posting what you're doing is an interactive experience. There's some level of interaction happening, and it's kind of fun. So, is that a game? Is participating in Facebook a game? And obviously, there's a whole spectrum there of possibilities in between. So, I think that there's certainly lots of opportunity to continue to build hardcore experiences and kind of the more typical game experience that we're used to in the commercial game industry on the mobile device. But there's certainly a much richer opportunity in terms of exploring new possibilities, sort of closer towards the casual end of the spectrum. So I wanted to also share some numbers. As a founder of a tech startup, we're obviously very focused on ultimately delivering an experience that people are going to be interested enough to actually buy and consume. And numbers are typically boring, but it's interesting to kind of stop and think a little bit about these things. So there's 4 billion subscribers by the spring of next year. That's a significant chunk of the planet that's effectively got a phone. About 1 billion of those people, and close to 2.5 billion by 2010, carry a phone that is Flash enabled. This is by no means a plug for Flash as a rich media platform, but it is interesting to think about being effectively able to have a rich media conversation and game interaction and playful interaction with a couple of billion people around the world. And it's a common language and a common platform. There's a couple of 100 million smartphones out there today, which in and of itself is not a very interesting number, but when you compare that to the fact that that is a much larger number than all of the game consoles combined, Nintendo Wii, the PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360. So there's in terms of reach and accessibility, the mobile phone becomes a very interesting platform in terms of reach. And lastly, the fastest growing sector of the gaming industry is in fact the casual gaming and the casual games. And so there's an audience, there's an appetite, and I think this speaks to the fact that consumer behavior is changing and evolving, and there's an inherent interest in connection and play that is happening in a very mass scale. Lastly, mobile games are projected to be a $6 billion industry. And why is this relevant and interesting? Well, it's relevant and interesting in the sense that if someone is willing to pay for something, it's usually because it means something to them. So with that, I wanted to share a little bit with you some of the aspects of mobile social play design that we've been thinking about, and we've been sort of trying to develop and learn. And this is a great opportunity actually to engage in the conversation with you and calibrate our thoughts. So there are 4 pillars of game design that we really think about. One is the massively multiplayer aspect. In other words, really trying to index for engaging as large a number of people in the experience as possible, right? And that as a design constraint, that already starts to inform what you need to provide as a designer. The second is social. So what about the experience is inherently social in terms of it being the game experience providing you a way to communicate with others. Location aware, which we talked about. And lastly, real time, which is effectively talking about the sense of synchronous communication where the engagement is happening very much as Robin was talking about, where you are in real time, you're competing for that time slice in the moment to participate in this experience, and all of the issues around to what extent do you disengage from the now moment of your day-to-day life and involve yourself in the now moment in the experience that you're connecting with. We're also looking at sort of what other design constraints can we use to inform our decision making. One of them is universal appeal. If we're talking about a device that's deployed around the world to the degree that it is, and the goal is to kind of engage in this ubiquitous gaming experience, one of the challenges that you have, obviously, is that you need to appeal, you need to be cross-cultural, you need to be culturally agnostic, and you need to take into considerations not using text unless you plan to localize every aspect of your game application, and to what extent are you able to engage in a truly universally appealing experience. Simplicity is key, because the minute, obviously, you're trying to appeal to as broad an audience as possible, then simplicity becomes one of the primary factors. And lastly, our other sort of framing design principle is group participation. That is fundamentally about using the mobile device as a tool to participate with the group. The challenge with this, of course, is in order to stay inside of that triangle, you can very easily end up in a lowest common denominator scenario where your experience is now very blurred and not very interesting to any one individual. And that is obviously one of the factors that we keep in mind. So lastly, the sort of the image that I wanted to leave you with is, and the question as part of kind of fueling the conversation for the rest of the day, how do we engage the world in mobile play? Is there a game that you can play with the world? And that's the end of my talk. So I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Okay. So before we move on much further, I wanted to just make a little bit of a comment about the conversation that we've had so far. As I started off the discussion, I really wanted to just kind of give everyone a notion of how a commercial game designer might see the context of mobility and what we need to consider when we're building stuff. Then Ian gave us a really great analysis of what it means to problematize that design space a little bit, to try to reach for something more quirky, to make something that's relevant, but also struggle with those issues in a pseudo-commercial environment, and then also in the real commercial environment, like actually taking in a kind of an academic concept and then moving it out into the space and making it a realized concept and seeing where it has holes. And then Neville's sort of left us with this open question of if we really were going to try and make something that was relevant, not just for the person that's the expert traveler, or just for the lady at the grocery store with kids, but for everybody, something that was universally appealing, what would that be? Which is, in and of itself, an entirely different way of looking at the process and the accessibility issues. And we heard from Kevin yesterday about the specific ways in which you can approach sort of gathering information from the space of the real world and putting it into, a mobile context and information context. And so, does anyone have a super burning question that they want to ask before we move into an open discussion? Like just something that you really, you're in the hot seat, you really want to say something?
Could be lightly, mildly burning.
Mildly burning? All right, one.
So I found Ian's the concept of mobile experience or mobile gaming being the decompression of the real world a really interesting concept. And I was wondering, when you look at the ambassadors, there's something that's obviously coded when you look at it. You see the skull, which is
Right.
kind of tweaked, and if mobile gaming is an anamorphic decompression of something, what are the kind of clues that we see in the real world for things to be changed or brought into perspective?
Right. So I guess the mistake that we made was assuming that the device itself would act as enough as that stain, and that someone would go, gosh, I've got this thing in my hand, and I'm in line, and I'm playing this game where I'm in line, and there's all this weird stuff going on, and that would be enough. That anything more than that would be no longer subtle. And it turns out, there are a lot of reasons why this didn't take off in the way that I thought it might, and we could go into all of those. But I think one of them is just that the
Just kidding.
In part it was a niche product, and it's exactly the opposite of the game that anyone can play. But I don't know what the answer is, but it's something like that stain, and you look at the thing and you go, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong. You got that when you played Cruel to Be Kind too, because you would walk up to someone and you would be embarrassed already before you said anything because you knew, well, I don't know if this person is playing or not, and that was enough. And so we didn't accomplish that. We didn't get that stain in the design.
It seems like QR codes and other sort of physical artifacts kind of serve that purpose a little bit, maybe.
What do you think, Kevin?
Well, okay.
Go for it.
I talked about it a little bit yesterday that when we first worked with them, it was precisely because they were from another planet, because they'd never been seen before in North America, and it was a long time ago, and blah blah blah. I think there's everybody really wants them to succeed because fundamentally they're a good idea. They will never happen in the United States.
Let's all weep. It's just a little cry.
And so I think that, let me put it this way. There was a recent Ralph Lauren campaign that was around building basically a proprietary Ralph Lauren code, because that's a good idea. We need more formats. And you would download the Ralph Lauren reader so that you could scan codes when you were in the store, the one place where you're not lacking information about Ralph Lauren products.
And then would like your purse glow or something?
I
Your
don't-
wallet would just go dee
I don't know.
dee
I
dee.
didn't- I didn't
money
It
tells
would
you you're
fall out of it.
awesome.
Yeah. Bye, Ralph Lauren.
I think that the use of QR codes or any kind of optic markers to within our cultural and technological context, I think using them to actually alienate is useful. I think thinking about them within the continuum of everyday life is not practical, right? So,
Yeah.
I think like
Yeah.
any game that would use something like that is interesting if it seeks to,
To make noise.
to
Right.
make noise,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Of course, the difference between the QR code and the skull is that the skull can be decoded. Right? You look at it
Exactly.
and you know, oh, this can be
Yeah.
decoded. And I
Ooh,
know that,
scary.
yes, technically you can, if you know how to decode the QR code,
Yeah.
then you can. But otherwise, it's just noise that's disruptive. It's
Yeah.
kind of stirs things up.
Yeah, even actually the poster for the symposium, I put it up on my kitchen just because I thought it would be funny to put it in on my refrigerator, like surrounded by children's photographs and drawings and like, the parking ticket that I didn't pay and stuff. And in that context, it's just like this totally bizarre object. It's completely disruptive. And people would come over to the house for dinner and be like, I can't read that. What is that? And I'm like, oh, I'm doing this really cool, like, future-looking, like, panel on mobility and gaming. And they're like, that has nothing to do with what you do. I was like, well, that's the whole point, though. It's kind of going to be interesting and academic and kind of like, we're going to have all these creative ideas. Like, doesn't that say that to you? And I was just like, I'm a dork. Just like shame, ribbons of shame. It's not something that people can understand. And I think one of the things I was thinking about is especially as Neville was talking, is the difference between making a commercial game, which is where I've been squarely situated in my paid practice, making games that are problematizing or noisy, which is where I live when I'm an academic or an indie gamer, which is my other job, and then just really trying to make something relevant or like that brings joy or wellness or some sort of knowing to the world, which is where I always want to be, and those are three very different roles, and they almost always seem exclusive to one another. It's very rare that I get an opportunity to work on a game that I feel will make the world a better place and creates a little bit of noise and is actually readable by someone that's not literally having the same comic book library as myself. So that was something I wanted to ask you guys about, because you come from such different backgrounds, and yet I know you're all the same deep inside.
Yeah, one thing I did just as we were presenting is I just went and looked at the top 25 games in the App Store right now.
Awesome.
Right, and it's like
Mr. Ah.
Huh?
Is it Mr. Ah up there?
No.
Oh,
I
damn,
got
he was.
I got Bejeweled.
Okay.
I've got Frogger. I've got Tetris, Solitaire, Doom, Scrabble, Sims 3, Family Guy Uncensored, Rock Band, Doodle Jump.
Oh, Doodle Jump, that's it, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean,
It's pretty good.
I mean, the thing that's really interesting is that like most of the things that we're really talking about and really care about are in no way reflected in the top 25
No.
thing, right?
No, and it's just commonly accepted. I worked at Electronic Arts for many years, and I worked on The Sims. That was my first job, was making objects for The Sims 2, which is a really odd job when you think about it, like tuning little flower tables for virtual people that live in a tiny simulated world. But it's very common for Sims products to do exceedingly well on the phone platform, because everybody knows what the brand means and everybody understands what the concept is, that you're going to be just making neat. You're just going to be cleaning up after this little dumb digital ant person, and it's going to totally rock your socks off to feel like you organized the shit out of their life. And like you're in that crowded train car, and like some stinky dude next to you is eating like a burger with onions on it, and you're just like, I just want to clean up, They're really popular. And it's so crazy. You can put the little Sims logo on just about any kind of game, and it will just rocket off the shelves.
I want Sims Business Traveler.
Right, exactly. I mean,
Sims Business Traveler would work.
Right.
I mean, it really would. It would be funny.
Yeah, I think you peel away the Sims skin, and below that you're back to the same set of compulsions which you listed out there. There's very specific goals that you're going after, and certainly having a skin that is very well branded, obviously is going to.
And the only
float
one
to the
out
top
there.
of
There's
the
not a
App Store.
competitor. There's no one competing in the space.
I mean, I just think that it's useful to sort of like bookmark and say that when we're talking about, well, what are the things that are really going to get a lot of people to do it? It's IP, basically, right? It's like, that it has a lot to do with, it has a lot to do with things that have nothing to do with what we're talking about here, and that, in a way that sort of lives over here, that the mechanics of adoption have their own market forces.
I I find myself wondering if we were going to design a game for a universal IP that would accomplish some like super killer goal. Like let's pick an IP. Like we could go Barbie, or maybe like NFL, NASCAR. You know, what would be something that we would want to see in the world that we could, if we could just get that brand slapped on it and out there, like something that was a little bit noisy but a little bit good. You know.
Yeah, universally appealing doesn't necessarily have to be good, right? I mean,
Well,
there's a lot of not so
could be
good
mean.
universally appealing things, but yeah.
Barbie Fashion Avenger. Like, girl, that looks awful. It just takes photos of girls in bad skirts and stuff. Could be really popular.
Well, but I mean, you know, this really intriguing idea of a global game, a game that everyone can play. It also demands a concept that everyone shares. And if
Michael
you really
Jackson.
think hard about it, maybe Michael Jackson. I mean, normally when we talk about something that everyone shares, it's death. That's what we all have in common. We all die.
We also
So there's
breathe.
your game. It's
Everybody dies.
Everybody
Yeah.
dies.
There is
the
actually a
title.
game called
Yeah.
Everybody
There
Dies.
is.
It's
There is.
fantastic,
Yeah.
So I mean, actually, that's
Buy it.
that's kind of at the center of the of the design constraint, because is there an IP out there that is universally appealing? I mean, Barbie arguably is already very skewed
Barbie
towards
dies.
specific geographic locations.
Barbie
right?
dies.
I mean, soccer is a fairly
Soccer, that's a
universal
good one.
phenomenon, right? That you
Or
could kind of wrap
football.
around.
Well, I mean, there's something that I'm dying to bring up, so I'm just going to take this pause in the conversation to
Do
do
it.
it. And that's that, you know, Robin, you just said it again. You're on the train, and there's the guy eating next to you, and your examples here were, really interesting, kind of ordinary place examples. But here we are in Los Angeles,
Where
and we're
everyone is
talking about the subway. Are you kidding? You know, what's mobility mean here? It means the automobile. You know, and that's one example of a space, a play space that I mean, you remember playing games in the car, when you go on road trips.
Yeah.
But here you are every day, sitting there. I lived here for a long time, and just yesterday I realized I'd been gone for long enough because I was surprised at how long it took for me to get from the west side up here to campus. There's all that dead time, all that anxious time of complete existential dread, and there you are, and what do you have? You have NPR or something, So it's an interesting example
Which is
of
just more existential dread.
it's an interesting counterpoint to the global game, because the just traffic is not exactly death. I mean, it's a
It feels like it.
it's a maybe a variant of death.
It's a rehearsal.
But it's something that exists in a particular context, and it's different here than it is in Atlanta, where I live, for example, where there's also a similar kind of automobile
So you mean
culture.
like a game I could play in my car without crashing, but would also
Yeah,
problematize
you
my life?
probably couldn't. I mean, how would you play it? Would it be voice or?
I guess. Honk your horn.
I mean, I'll tell you.
There you go.
Whether it's traffic or the subway. I mean, like if we draw some line somewhere, and let's draw it 50%. Let's say that it's a game for cities. It's a game that is for people who are in some way urban. And I think that one of the fundamental qualities of being urban, whether it's sitting in traffic or whether it's next to that guy on the subway, which is oftentimes me, by the way.
I forgive you.
It's cool.
What he's actually doing is playing a game about being a slob, though, on his phone.
No, it's totally earnest. But one of the qualities of one of the things that it means to be in a city, one of the things that we're doing when we're in cities, is that we're surrounded by strangers all the time.
Yeah.
And that like there's a game that I play. I'm the only one playing it. But whenever I'm in a space that has shared Wi-Fi, most recently on the plane here, there was Wi-Fi on the plane, and then everybody who has a Mac, their name shows up in your shared folder, and so I just Google everybody who's sitting around me, and I'm like, who are these people actually?
People?
And it's really deeply satisfying.
It's so invasive.
But what it does is it actually diminishes the I'm not looking to make any friends. I'm not looking to talk to them. But what it does is it says that because it was like it turns out because it was great. I was like, oh, this woman who's 2 seats in front of me turns out to be the senior fashion editor at da 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 da, And then I looked and I was like, oh, she also knows my friend Allison. There was something that was sort of satisfying about just feeling like, okay, yeah, they're strangers,
Yeah.
but that, you know,
Well,
But
they're
even
not human anymore suddenly.
yeah.
Yeah.
that's because they're from New York. Yeah.
But I think one way or another, I mean, it's like there's something, you know, I guess I often talk about trying to use all of this to try to make the world a little bit more fantastic and elevate it out. But there's a part of me also that finds the actual information that's underneath all of this itself to sometimes be satisfying.
Right. But I mean, as a counterpoint to what you just said, which is that, okay, let's narrow the domain to urban space. What we have in common is presence among strangers, which is sort of this very, you know, modern notion of the city, you know, coming from the New Yorker at the table. In some ways, that's actually not universal. You know, here, for example, in LA, you're not really surrounded by strangers. It's you, and it's your steering wheel. But the traffic gets abstracted into this familiar character, which is the Mercedes. It's you and the steering wheel, and you're going home or you're going to work, and it's Terry Gross on the radio.
Okay.
And you kind of don't have that same alienating modern city experience. So I'm suspicious of this idea that there's some universal acid wash that we can apply to all of these.
There's definitely the game you play when you're in your car, where you look across at the other car and you see what the other person driving that car looks like, and you're like, no way. You know, like there's that game. Like, that guy can't go with that car, or that car doesn't go with that lady, or no wonder they're driving so slow. They're 89 years old, you know? Like, you do play that game where you try to guess the person. I recently was driving my car very slowly, which is not common in LA, because I had a fish in a bowl in the front seat. I was taking a fish in a bowl somewhere, and I got in front of someone that was in a big hurry, and they literally laid on the horn the whole way down this very slow, you know, residential street with the speed bumps. And at the end of the street, you know, they pulled up next to me. It was a very, I'm sure, very nice, middle-aged Asian man, and he was screaming at me through the window. And I rolled down the window, and I encouraged him to roll down his window, and I said, I have a fish in the front seat. And like, that was such joy. Like, I haven't experienced that much joy driving in LA in a really long time. He was like, oh, sorry. Yeah. It's just like everything's off the table now, you know?
Right.
And that was a unique person-to-person moment where I was like, you have no idea what my context is, bitch. Like,
but
I
it
have
was
a car with a fish in it.
It was all about the metonymy of you and the car. It was really, you know, the relationship between the car and the individual. And you puzzle it out, and then you realize, oh, like that was a surprising automobile.
Yeah.
So
some people had a baby on board that was not a baby.
yeah, and certainly if the driver had some more awareness of your context, that interaction would have been very different. And so that kind of ties back to, you know, there's an article about a description of the Facebook experience being providing sort of ambient awareness of the people around you, of your social graph. So, you know, what your friends are doing and what the people around you are doing are not in your direct vision, line of sight. They're sort of in your peripheral vision. You kind of know what's going on. And so, you know, if there is a mobile application that is in your car while you're driving that notches up the ambient awareness of the other drivers around you, perhaps there's a little bit more information there that fellow drivers can have about you to change the social dynamic of the interaction. Very out there, not a very specific
not at all.
example.
No, I mean,
Why not?
What we're dancing around is a children's game that is played in cars. That's license plate spot, right? I mean, that's basically what that is. And you know, but if that's built not around recognition, but familiarity or recurrence or what have you.
Or just emotional state. Like, I would really like to know if the person that's driving next to me has had a super shitty day. Like, I might cut them a break, you know?
Yeah.
Well, there was that Japanese design with the tail, the car with the. Do you remember this? The car with the tail that you could make it wag, or you could have it.
That is so adorable.
Yeah.
They not only, well, I'm just going to say sticker technology, sock technology, just why can't we catch up with Japan? Why? So sad.
Anybody?
So in terms of creating something that's truly meaningful, is that what we're talking about? Something that literally bumps up my awareness of the other people's emotional states around me? Like, do I want to know that the lady next to me had a bad day? Maybe I'm lying. Maybe not. Maybe she's saying, you know, maybe the woman doesn't want me to know. I wrote down here something interesting. You said something about being telepathic, and then I wrote telepathic versus programmed. And next to it I wrote, when your phone tells you how to get there, you are a robot. Like, when I was executing the instructions to get here, I really was just like, I'm trying really hard. Like, I was talking to my phone because I felt like I was letting it down. It's like putting the little blue dot further and further from the red dot. I really feel like I'm not executing the way that my phone would if it were driving. And we're rapidly getting to the point now where the difference between what I can do and what my phone can do is getting narrower. And I kind of fail it sometimes.
I can do a lot of things my phone can't do,
You're a more talented person than I am, Ian.
even when driving. Should we take the questions?
Sure.
On the subject of I can do a lot of things that my phone can't do, I was wondering, and this goes back to the guilt issue of playing games. I can think of one or two tasks on the computer where, in effect, the computer uses the intelligence of the person to accomplish some goal that it can't accomplish by itself. But it seems to me that that's something that could be a goal for social games, where, in effect, we put all these people sort of secretly to work on something that, when they find out the result, makes them feel better about the time they spent.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the best example I know of this was Louis van Aan's project out of Carnegie Mellon called the ESP game, and I was looking at it with my partner Frank shortly after it launched, and we were looking at it. So the game. How many people know it, by the way? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I guess it was like 5 years ago, maybe even longer, and the ESP game said, okay, you sign on and you give your name, you give a username, and it says, okay, we're going to test your ESP with a partner, and we're going to go find that person, and it says, okay, I found you a partner, and it's somebody named Ian, and we're in 5 seconds, I'm going to show you both the same picture, and I want you to type whatever comes to your mind when you see it, and if you guys say the same thing, you'll get a point and move on. And how many points can you as a team get together, in 10 minutes, whatever it is. And there's like a bunch of really difficult game design problems to solve there, right? Like, what happens if the other person drops off? Because you have no way to communicate with him or her, whatever, right? There's no means of communication. All you're doing is typing words into a box, and they can't see the words that you're typing unless they type the same words. So how do you deal with it when somebody else drops off? How do you deal with it when you're stuck? And so Frank and I were sort of like playing it for a while, just trying to understand how they did certain things. And then at a certain point, I turned to him and I said, if these guys were smart, they would actually mine all this data, because basically they're getting two strangers to agree that that is indeed a picture of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, right? And that if whoever was doing this, because we didn't know who was doing it at the time, if whoever was doing this was smart, they would be using this to identify images that computers can't identify for themselves, poor computers. And that turns out to be exactly what it was. It was an experiment in getting people to do the things that computers find difficult.
And it was really successful, right?
It was super successful and super fun to play, I should add. Like really, we were playing it for a long time before it occurred to me that this might be instrumental.
Right.
And one of the things that's interesting is that Google ended up buying it, and they renamed it the Google Image Labeler. And
Oh, man.
the call to action is no longer to test your ESP with a stranger, but rather help Google label all the images on the web. And it's like, God, that sounds fucking great. Like, you guys have a huge amount of money, and I'll do this
For free.
for free, and I love that idea. And I always look. The ESP game is no longer online, but I have a bunch of screenshots saved, and I always look at, like, okay, on any given day, what are the high scores on the Google Image Labeler, right? Game, whatever, and it's like half, or a quarter of what they ever were on the ESP game, because it's no goddamn fun. It's exactly the same dynamics and mechanics, exactly, right? The only difference is that it announces itself as instrumental. It announces its goal to be social or whatever, and it's just like that is, where games live is in the ability to actually divorce themselves from that for a moment, right? That's what makes them fun. And so whenever there are these calls to like, oh, why don't we make a game that has some great social goal? And it's like, okay, but it's problematic if a game announces itself as having a great social goal, because then it's like,
it's just pointless.
Well, this also assumes that helping Google label images is a great social goal. And one of the fascinating things about the game is that when Google destroys the game by contextualizing it, they're actually being weirdly more honest and exiting the kind of Ender's Game situation and into the real world. So it's very strange.
They may have done it because of legal reasons. I mean, it might be that once they owned it, it would suddenly put them in line for a huge lawsuit if they left it up the way that it was. I think we're getting close to time, right? I think we have about maybe 2 more minutes. I'm just checking my internal clock. 3:45. So we got a little bit more time. All right. So
One little sort of anecdotal thing regarding the sort of how do we harvest game players' time towards some cause. So one interesting statistic is that supposedly there's about 15 million subscribers to the World of Warcraft game. And on average, you're looking at about 10 hours of gameplay per week per user. So that amounts to about 150 million hours of human attention per week being focused on World of Warcraft. Now,
as opposed to television, which was where it used to be focused. So that's something
Right.
that I always try to do when this
Right.
stat is made public, is that we used to just sit in front of the boob tube and do nothing. So at least
right.
they're
So
doing
now
something.
now we're pressing buttons in front of the boob tube. And Wikipedia supposedly in its entirety took about 150 million human man-hours. So it's the equivalent productivity level of all of Wikipedia every week. So that's a lot of human attention that could be directed towards all kinds of useful causes. How you do that is, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also a very weird way of thinking about how we spend our time and live our lives. What I really want to do is to live a gratifying life.
Hedonist.
And I don't. It doesn't need to be gratifying all the time. Otherwise, I wouldn't be an academic, I suppose. But it should not always need to answer for not orienting itself toward productivity. Isn't this what games are all about in some ways? And if you look at something like World of Warcraft, you can also recast it as productivity, and a lot of people have also looked at the ways that young people learn about collaboration and leadership through the game. So it's very troubled and messy, and hard to come down on one side or another of any of these experiences. But what I think bothers me most is when I get a game that doesn't even do that. So the thing that pisses me off so much about Foursquare is doing nothing. It really, literally is just this wonderful candy coating on top of everything else. On top of another candy coating. So I'm going to go to the club, and then awesome stuff is going to be at the club that's virtual, in addition to me getting boozed up and trying to pick up women or whatever.
But I'll argue that Foursquare does a bunch of things very, very well.
Well, people like it, right? That's the thing that,
so
that
that's
you
a
have
clue,
to contend
right?
with. Yeah.
As per our top 20 list, we should probably pay attention to it.
But I think one of the things. So there's the badge system that you talked about, and I think that whole idea of just a sort of elementary achievement system, it's facile, et cetera. But whatever the thing that a lot of people find deeply satisfying within it has to do with the mayorship, right. Which for anybody who's not doing it or using it, it's basically whoever's been in a place the most times in 60 days and is checked in gets the mayor. And the thing that does, unlike the participation award for showing up, is it puts your activity within an asynchronous social context around a place. It basically takes a place and adds time and people on top of it. I think that's actually very powerful.
And it's not something that a lot of people have exposure to in their daily lives. I think being academic, being game design nerds, being somewhat procedural in our thinking, we may take for granted the magic of some sort of contemporary notion of state in the world that is mirrored back to me on my phone. That's actually, that's something that I'm sure my mother would find really fascinating if she went to her favorite flower shop, for example, in South Florida, and was like, oh, I was just here. Oh, I remember that last year when I came here and I bought all those roses, and now they're still growing in my garden. Even just that would be a nice referent. A lot of people don't have that kind of a digital referent every day, as opposed to people like us who are on Doppler or, use the airport cane.
There were some hands up a minute ago, but we just talked right over them. I don't
Hands,
remember where
hands,
they
hands. Ideas.
Thank you. I think we touched a little bit on this earlier, but sort of the convergence of almost gaming and work in modern application design. Doctors apparently who get gamed in their youth are better at the modern medical technology because they have the motor skills and stuff like that. What of some of the stuff that you guys have done that you've seen, with the exception of the disaster of the Google taking over the ESP game, what are some of the things that you've seen taken over from the game world that you think have been really effective in terms of making the arduous real world more fun?
So I don't know if I think this is effective or not, but this is a good example. There's a company called Seriosity, which is an interesting name for a company, that makes this Microsoft Outlook plugin. They call it a tent. And it's like WoW Gold for your email, basically. So it's like this little attention currency that you can trade. And you, in addition to sorting your email inbox by name or by date, you can sort it by cost, basically. What has someone offered you in this script attention currency to read their email? So, theoretically, if you want to get your, the CEO's attention, you've hoarded a bunch of this, attention gold that you could do so perhaps by spending it. And the idea is to reduce, the number of insignificant or unnecessary emails that people send in big companies, which happens all the time. So that's one example. Now, the question is does that make work more fun? I mean, it certainly changes your perspective on work, and maybe that's the way to look at it. I mean, I don't know that the world gets to be work or fun, or we kind of have black and white approaches to anything, but it certainly changes the workplace environment. Maybe that's a better frame to wrap around some of these. That's the example I always use. Do you guys know
that
of
example
others?
was actually discussed at an office I participated in
Yeah.
as a way of actually keeping people from sending meaningless emails.
Right, and
the
I think,
problem
that
being
was the
that
primary
people
goal.
just send too much, and then it became, then your boss could check and see how much coins you had, and it'd be like a real world indicator of how much you just sit on email.
Yeah, but some of them
and
have
then
also
people
used it
just,
as
never get enough.
you can cash out then later too. So you could, if you collect enough of this stuff, then you get like a calculator watch or something. I don't know.
Telescope.
It was also, a very similar thing was also tried with a site called I'm in Like With You, which took the exact same approach of basically producing an attention currency around dating, which was not successful, and funny enough turned into a game site. But I think also it's that, games do this all the time. I think about it every time, there's some big sports rivalry, whatever. You think about what an asshole you'd have to be to stand up and hold an American flag and say that you're proud to be an American and put a big American flag on the back of your car. But every time, it's like New York versus Boston or whatever, everybody can be like, yeah, I'm from New York, right? Like this is happening now, and it gives you an excuse within an abstract system, which is baseball, to be super proud of wherever it is you're from, and to express something that is really nasty within the human mind, which is to be somehow proud of wherever it is you are, as if you had a choice in where you were born or what have you. And it focuses that through an abstract system rather than the systems of nationalism, et cetera. I mean, they filter through everyday life all the time, and I think it's not about necessarily even setting out to produce it. Good games allow us to socialize in ways that we might not otherwise get to do.
Other questions? I want a system to get loot for carrying the microphone around.
I have more of a nuts and bolts design question as it relates to mobility in games rather than something higher level like you guys have been talking about. There are a lot of ways to enjoy your interaction with the game, from kind of large scale things like winning a campaign, completing the story, interacting with the cast. But in non-mobile games, you can gain a lot of pleasure from the immediate act of interacting with the control scheme.
Right.
And the challenges of mobility in gaming, a lot of the things that you're talking about, you're emphasizing the rewards from the strategy, the overarching things, and there's been a complete omission of like that immediate interaction. And obviously, you can get down to like the platonic ideal of an action button, like Cannibalt. But when you guys are trying to make really satisfying games, is that constraint mean that you don't, like, is that completely off the table? There is no, I mean, well, you kind of know where I'm going with this.
Yeah. That's a good question. I have a canned answer for that, so I'll let someone else take it unless you want.
Well, I mean, I'll give you my version. So definitely, I think that one of the design challenges is figuring out exactly that. One of the most gratifying aspects of the compulsion loop is that immediate gratification you get in okay, I did this and this happened back, right? And the minute you've got a mobile game and the context is much more complicated and layered, and you're also networked, and so there's latency issues, etc. So all of a sudden now all of your meaningful feedback is not necessarily coming back to you with that kind of same level of gratification. So you have to design around that. One of the approaches that we're thinking about is you combine two loops. You've got a local immediate loop, and you layer that over the global loop, so that and your immediate loop feeds into the global loop, and the global loop feeds back. So there's sort of some interaction between the compulsion of you and your immediate feedback and the participation with the group. It's very abstract, but
Well, so yeah, I mean, if every person was part of an orchestra all around the world that was just doing a one-button action, like, say, taking a wet finger and running it around the edge of a glass, and everyone in a giant loop all the way around the planet did that successfully for 2 minutes, they would each have the experience of having created this awesome sound on the glass, but on some higher plane of existence, there would be a loop of sound going all the way around the entire world, right? Like that's the kind of thing that gives you that local feedback, but that global feedback at the same time. I mean, I am 100% behind games that are super feel-oriented and juicy, and like a lot of the talks I've been giving lately have been almost exclusively about the design process at that game company where I work, and how we're focused almost exclusively on the feel of a game as it's 100% the focus of its design. And it's my personal bias that games that focus on strategy are more rewarding in the busy context of a mobile application. But I also, one of the things that Ben and I were talking about the other night was, what is the juicy thing? His perspective, and I'll express it for him while he's not here, is that it's the feedback between people within your context. So you just have to rely on the laugh or the like Fiero moment that happens when the three of you sitting next to each other at the movie theater all think of the same random thing, and like and one of you types it into your phone and it appears on all three screens, and you all like have a private chuckle without disrupting the movie. Like, that's the feedback cycle. It has to be kind of existing outside of the screen itself, but that's only because the moment-to-moment experience of moving a controller or pressing a button in that very rapport-oriented situation, like on your couch with your console, is so solitary. And I think if we can come up with the ultimate brain control device that allows me to be manipulating things but also interacting with other people, then it'll expand beyond that.
I mean, in answer to your question, I mean, this is an extremely provincial answer, and it just has to do with the. I spend a lot of time watching people play mobile games on the New York City subway, which is a very specific example. But I I just spend most of the commute just watching how people play, and one of the things that you realize quickly if you watch this is that the model that games normally have of undivided attention is shot, right? Like you're on there, and now you're jostled, or now you have the opportunity to sit, or now you have to get up and transfer, so that in fact games that can accommodate I have to stop this right now, or I don't have to pay attention for a few seconds, or what have you. That's a very different idea about designing the interaction for a game. I think it's one reason that tower defense games do very well on mobile, is that they're about a rapid response and then a kind of lull and then rapid response, and then lull. And it's why puzzle games like Bejeweled, et cetera, are things that can always accommodate an action and always provide some feedback for it, but also don't demand it. That, again, like that's not the only situation in which mobile games are played, but it is a common one, and I think it's worth thinking about it. I'm always surprised, like even today, just looking at like what the top 25 are, at how many of the games that a lot of people buy are not like that. Tap tap, yeah, Tetris, tap tap, whatever. Right? I mean, these are things that do not accommodate the complexity of the mobile of one's mobile experience. They seem to do fine, but I think that there's an opportunity to really rethink that.
Yeah, I would actually say that the thing that's more common for me now that I have an iPhone is that oh shit moment of like I didn't get off the train on time. I pressed the wrong button on the elevator yesterday, and there was a person in the elevator, and I made it go up 3 floors instead of going down 2 floors where we both wanted to go. And why? Because I was dicking around with my phone. Questions?
So there is definitely a lot of people that play games, but there are also a lot that don't play games. And with mobile media now, there is an opportunity to reach to those people that don't play games or they never play game. What could be the best strategies to reach out to those maybe different demographic or?
Do you guys believe that there are people in the world who don't play games?
Do you really? It seems hard for somebody that works in games.
No. Okay, don't think about digital games. So like take a step back from video games. Like, is there anyone here who hasn't played tag? I mean, I think the question is, do we apply the digital gaming paradigm to reach people who aren't necessarily hooked by digital games? But I think it's very important for us not to think of games as just shooting people or just moving blocks around on the screen. So with that, I'll let the panel answer.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is still true, the most popular digital game is Windows Solitaire. And why? Well, it comes with Windows, and Windows is, everywhere. So that's a great way in. Same with Brick Breaker. How many of you Blackberries, right? Blackberry Brick Breaker players? Some obsessive Brick Breaker. And it's just because it was on the device. The iPhone is the first opportunity with mobile devices to really break out of that whole nightmarish carrier distribution hell. And what happens, I think, and this is maybe partly reflected in this top 10 list, is the people who are buying those games aren't necessarily playing them. They've just purchased them, and then they sit as icons on their screen, taking up space and preventing them from finding the weather app, which was the one they really want. So maybe one game is enough in certain contexts. I don't know that we need to have as a goal that everybody turns into this really this kind of gamer's gamer. But maybe you have a sort of thing, something that you incorporate into your life and your experience. For example, I don't really read comic books and graphic novels, and it's okay.
Blasphemy.
It's okay. But every now and then, I will pick something up. It's recommended. And, I kind of go outside my normal media worldview, and then I enjoy it. And then I come kind of back into my usual predilections, and that's cool. It's just okay. We don't all have to do all the same things, and we don't have to all consume all media all the time. So one question we might ask though is for those people who are playing solitaire, what is it about solitaire that makes them want to play? Well, it's because their job is really shitty, and they don't want to do their normal work, and they don't want to do this stupid bullshit attempt email thing either. And so, solitaire is a way of kind of taking a break from that and clearing your head, and that's where a lot of casual games really come from, is just head clearing apparatuses. So we can think about design in those terms rather than thinking about the sort of universalization or the demographic, enhancement of the gaming sector from a business perspective.
Yeah, I think if you think about games in the way that you think about film or television as a mood control device, you engage in this activity, or listening to music, you engage in this activity to change your mindset and to just put yourself in a different place. Or the other opportunity is obviously is an emotional jungle gym, which is the other thing that a lot of film and great television, I think, provides, especially now lately. There's so many shows that allow you to sort of grasp and conceive of a set of characters and then kind of do a lot of mental gymnastics as you play through their roles. That's something that's become a real art form in the last 10 to 15 years, and it's incredibly popular. People love shows like Lost or even something like Hung, Bored to Death, which has just started recently. Those are shows that introduce you to people that are very strange and abstract, very odd caricatures of humanity, but they're fun to play with in your mind. And for the short period of the show, you really do get a very tactile sense that, like, Zach Galifianakis is just like a total freak, or whatever. And I think that games give us an opportunity to do that with a little bit more fidelity, a little bit more action, a little bit more engagement, but they're not new where they appeal. Whether it's, I want to do a little bit of emotional maneuvering and put myself into a place of calm by playing some solitaire, or I really want to have a couple laughs at, the plight of humanity by watching the show. They're not that different. Any thoughts before we wrap up the panel, you guys? We have a couple questions. How many? Do we have time for more questions? Maybe one more. One
Okay.
more.
You guys have to fight for it, I guess.
Okay. All right. What a gentleman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess this question, I think it kind of mainly pertains to Kevin, and I'm sorry I missed your talk last night. So maybe you already talked at length about this. But the question, I guess, is I was sort of familiar with the work and dropped out of contact with it for a while, and then for this panel I kind of checked out and I downloaded Drop 7 and promptly lost many hours of my life. It's a fantastic game, but I was kind of surprised by the fact that it doesn't seem to have anything about it that needs it to be mobile. It's could easily work on a home computer, I was just curious how you got to that kind of game.
Yeah.
It works really well on that platform, but it seems outside of maybe a business model. I couldn't think of a really good reason why it would be an iPhone application primarily, or how you would come to be designing that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's basically an artifact that dropped off of some other work that we'd done, and we had designed. Drop 7 is a puzzle game. Tetris plus Sudoku is how it's billed. It's a puzzle game that we have out on the iPhone that we had designed long ago and sort of didn't really have a home for. I mean, really 4 years ago, right? And ended up using a variation of it when we did a much larger thing for CBS, for this thing that we did with the writers of the show Numbers. It was just a little part of this much larger thing. It just proved to be, it was called Chain Factor, and it proved to be weirdly, sensationally popular. So that was just sort of part of this a much more area code type endeavor. And I think it really was just sort of when we were thinking about, what's a way for us to start getting development experience fundamentally on the iPhone, for us to take ourselves through school on that. We were like, this would work very well brought to the iPhone. It just it played to, I mean, it was really, it came out of watching the games that people were doing and be like, okay, it's something that you can do, with just, it's a single drop. You can stop playing it for 5 minutes and come back and da-da-da-da. So it fulfilled a lot of things that we were seeing in terms of conventional games. It is also true that it's not a very area code game in itself, but what it is it's sort of on our path to making the things that are more what you think of, the things that bring in all the things that we've been talking about, location, et cetera.
Which I think is a good place to leave the panel. Obviously, we all have aspirations and goals, like I talked about at the beginning. There's different parts of us who want to make these games that reach people. We want to make games that are commercially successful, so we continue to make games as a career, especially in this economic climate. It's not always easy. So I would encourage you to look up the work of the people on the panel, check it out, especially if it's on the iPhone. Go ahead and download it. Give it a try. And I say that because we're also all on the path to iterating and to excellence. We really want to get to a place where we reach those people that are halfway around the world that haven't actually picked up a a game yet, maybe, and felt the kind of joy that we want them to feel, or the kind of terror, or whatever it is that we're trying to get into their little brains. So I want to thank the panelists, especially Kevin. Thank you so much for filling in, and Neville, thank you so much for listening and for your great questions. And we look forward to dialoguing with you as the conference continues. Thank you.
It has been hard work. Thanks for coming. Where are you coming from?
I flew in from Menlo Park.
Menlo Park?
San Francisco.
Aha. I was just there a few days ago.
Yeah.
It's close by. I would guess maybe you're one of the few people who traveled. That's on. Traveled to be here.
I was there before while they were planning it. I got very involved. All that, so yeah. Story there. But I
don't think I want to hear it.
No, it's not really that interesting. It's not nice, but
so now are you living in the city or are you living in Palo
yeah,
Alto?
Menlo Park.
Where's Menlo Park?
It's like
It's the other side from.
It's like Mountain View on one side.
Yeah, so it's
Menlo Park, Redwood, and as you're going towards San Francisco. So yeah, my wife's doing her FA, and I'm doing we tried to coordinate.
It's hard.
It's
my wife moved with me when I did my master's degree in Boston. She hated living there. We had to move immediately after graduation. So it's hard to coordinate, but it's possible.
so this isn't that far.
No, it is. Did you drive? Doing the drive is actually fun. Have you ever done it? There's like 3 ways to go. And there's one way that's stunningly beautiful and takes a really long time. You have to be in the right mind. There's another way that's kind of a mix of both, and then the other way goes straight through all the farms, and it's just like straight highway through. And it's interesting, but not beautiful, because they're the industrial farms. But the way along the coast is like stunning. You stop in Big Sur, and Santa Barbara, and all that kind of stuff.
Very pretty.
So you're looking around school?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a few that I. More media arts focused. It isn't geared as much towards product design as it is towards ideation and social reforms. Going on. I don't know enough about really what's going on here.
Just check it out a little bit. I think the thing about graduate school is oftentimes you kind of go to work with some faculty members. So you just kind of look at our faculty page, and get a sense of who's here. We do a lot of very different things. We don't have like a focus of these programs. Everywhere from installation, games, to theory.
It's quite wide ranging.
The graduate program is less wide ranging than the undergraduate.
I was looking at the list pack too. It's still from that, it's hard for me to piece together how that relationship between the faculty and the students occurs.
Well, the mechanic is that when the first years come, they're assigned to a semi-random advisor. And then over that year, they get to know all the faculty. And the whole program is really about thesis. And the thesis gets going in the spring of the first year, but it carries through the entire second year. And so the students basically pick who they want to be on the thesis team. And that's really like the strongest, most mentoring. So usually the primary advisor is the main contact and gets you through the thesis. Your primary antagonist and also friend. And then you have other people on the team too who are also regular contributors to the thesis. It's very much of an MFA degree. We don't really have a lot of scheduled classes. It's really about you working in the studio and making work that you feel is
And is this connected to in some way to the MFA, like straight MFA?
The art MFA? The art department's MFA? Not really.
So the studios for this degree are in
It's different buildings, different faculty.
because more of a prototyping lab sort of thing.
It's more of a shared studio as opposed to an individual cubicle in their studio. And, but we have some larger spaces that are shared, and then we also have a shop and electronics lab, a room for doing shoots. And this is a hybrid space. It's not always set up like this. It's used for exhibitions and performances.
Are there any students here that I can?
Yeah, let's go find them.
And
What kind of work do
will
you
you
do?
sign my book?